Sir, I am Naytik Majumdar from class 9. Filix, you know that in every society, a normal rate of inflation occurs. But income rates does not go parallel, income increase in the income of people does not go parallelly with that. So how can these income rates be made in such a way so that it parallelly increases with the rate of the inflation that is occurring in the society? And one more thing, in the world trade, there is means the world trade depends upon the currency of one particular country. This may lead if any country's currency rate decreases with respect to that country's currency, then that country can become poorer. And but this will always have a means mostly have a good output on the country whose currency is being used in the world. So, can it be that there is a one particular united currency that is used only for the world trade with a stable amount of stable rate with respect to the individual currencies of the world? And why isn't this kind of thing implemented if it is good for the world?
Okay. So I'll take the currency bit first. So increasingly, I think there's not much that so we are moving towards a world where the government doesn't set the, so what if you're talking about the rate across different currencies? Increasingly, we are moving to a world where it's market determined, right? So there's a demand and supply of currency that determines the rates. And if you're talking about historically, it has been the case that US dollar has been used for trades and so on. So obviously US has a specific advantage because, that's basically, there's always a demand for their currency, right? So I think you're referring to that. And I don't know whether, if I read it correctly, you are also trying to relate it to domestic inflation. So, so it's everything has to be in dollar. Then the rupee rises, or inflation in rupee means that it's sort of, there's price rise in India, and that's going to impact that. So I think they are very real questions. Central banks in emerging market like economy like ours worry about that. When you say that whether they can control it, because it's all market determined, it's not easy for them to control unless they also begin participate in the market as a buyer or a seller. That's how they operate. But that also depends on, imagine you want to buy a lot of dollar, that also depends on your stock of dollar that you have historically built up. So it's a tricky situation for many emerging market economies to control this kind of situation, domestic inflation. And that's why sometimes there are concern about why you want to control inflation, apart from the fact that for international consideration, for trade consideration, for capital inflows, outflows consideration, other than the fact that your sort of domestic people are suffering because of high prices. So I think that's a concern that central banks in every emerging market economy is continuously sort of taking into account. What steps they take depends on the reserve that they have sort of accumulated over the years, but that is something that they try to control. And so inflation, kind of trying to control inflation targeting, part of the reason for that central government does that, it's not just the domestic concerns, but it's also this kind of international concerns, where your point I think is very valid. And they try to do it in various ways. They are not always very, very effective, especially if you allow for capital flows and inflows and outflows. But then there has been extreme measures in the past where the government has stopped this kind of capital inflow and outflow, and that sort of automatically builds up reserves. So that also has been tried. So there are various things, but each of them are internationally not very sort of easy to implement, because the moment you try to do that, you're impacting international investors, and there's a political economy which works there. So these are difficult steps, but all emerging market economies grapple with this issue and try to do something about that. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I forgot to touch upon that. Yeah, so the point is new currency, as Kaushik was talking about money. The same thing applies to new currency. I float a new currency. I call it Indian currency, whatever it is, the international Indian currency. Who is going to buy, people have to believe that currency is going to remain stable. So there is a trick, and there is this, self-fulfilling kind of a thing, that if I believe that that currency is going to be stable, I'm going to start buying and purchasing stuff in that currency. That makes it stable. That then more people believe in that. Exactly the point of, like money that he was talking about, is all notional, right? So the moment you float it, it's not, there's no anchor to it. It's not as if that you are saying that, so many goals or so many physical goods are, pegged to that currency. And the moment you don't do that, it's all people's mind. And that is always inherently a problem with any notional, currency or unit of value like money. So I think that's the inherent problem of learning that.
You want to say something?
Yeah, very briefly, I would say this. The dominant currency right now, of course, is the US dollar. And there was a phase in history when the dominant currency was the British pound sterling. And it's after the First World War, in particular, that dollar slowly emerged, because the entire 19th century, Britain was leading the trade situation in the entire world, and the pound sterling was the dominant currency. After the First World War, difficulties came about in the British economy, England's economy, and US emerges. Now, to answer your question about this alternative currency, in recent years, very recent years, there's been some talk of thinking of a BRICS currency, or India trying to have rupee rupee emerging as something like an alternative currency. But at the end of the day, the strength of that will depend on the strength of the produce of that particular country. The Indian export situation is very poor vis-a-vis the export situation of many of the other countries, including even countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, which seem to be doing very well in some of the products, for example, textile goods and so forth, where even these two small countries have a much bigger presence in the international export world vis-a-vis India. India had a good presence about 15 or 20 years back, but that has gone down. So what I'm trying to say is that the strength of an economy's currency being an accepted world currency depends on how much that particular country has a presence in the entire export market. If you have a very strong presence, and if that presence is continuously growing vis-a-vis the presence of the other countries, then there's some chance of your currency becoming a major currency. The US is there because of the predominance of the American sort of presence in the world of technology, industrial goods, and so forth and so on. And it is likely to continue for some period of time. Having an alternative currency will not automatically or immediately lead to that particular currency being accepted. There's been some effort towards that, but it has not really resulted in any success.
Yeah, this is emphasizing the same. It is in many ways very unfair, because if your currency is used like the US gets a huge return out of that. But correcting this is in the psychology of billions of people. China would love to replace the world currency with the Chinese currency. But to gain that almost a mystical psychological space is very difficult. And US uses, Pulin just referred to the BRICS initiative. Trump has given an open threat that if BRICS does that, Trump is going to immediately impose tariffs and try to crash that, because you get a big advantage. One country, the unfairness, it's unfair, but here is Ecuador, tiny country. I don't know if you know, Ecuador does not have its own currency. It was not being able to manage its inflation. So what the Ecuador government decided to do is to use US dollars. So even for local bazaars, they have no currency of their own, US dollars. How do you think they get these US dollars? Trade? No, just by selling goods. Taking their currency. So in fact, it's one-way trade. You have to send your goods to USA to get hold of those pieces of paper. It's not even usual trade. For US, it's massive gains. Ecuador sends goods, US prints notes and sends them to Ecuador. That's it, because Ecuador needs it for its own bazaars. So once you get control of a currency in the world, which the US has, massive gains. These are called seniorage income to the country. Needs to be corrected, but it's a very, very difficult job. So how do you correct it is not clear at all.